Let's start with session 1, and the scripture reading for this is the first chapter of Revelation. Right away, you will encounter images and phrases that are difficult to come to terms with. So let me sort of give you some points of orientation for this. The very first word of the book of Revelation is the word apocalypse, the Greek word apocalypse, usually translated as revelation, which is an excellent translation. That is what apocalypse means. It means pulling back a curtain to show us something, and to invite us more deeply into what the author wants us to see. Apocalypses were very common in the ancient world. People love them. So we're not so familiar with apocalypses, but ancient people were. And they tend to follow certain patterns. Apocalypses will use very vivid colors, numbers, sort of exaggerated imagery to make their point. They often take people on a journey. And that's what we'll see in Revelation, certainly. The journey can be going up into layers of heaven or down into layers of the underworld, and we'll see that in Revelation in chapter 4. We're going to go up into heaven. Or it can be journeying out into the future or back into the past, and Revelation does that as well. So we go with the author, who is John of Patmos, on this journey, this visionary journey, and then he comes back to us with an urgent message of hope. So that's what the word apocalypse means, contrary to what Hollywood and other venues want us to think, that it means destruction and death and catastrophe. It doesn't mean that. It means revelation. It means pulling back a curtain to show us something. So John is using that word because he wants to show us something. Then another word that he uses in this opening chapter that I think is misunderstood is the word prophecy. And prophecy does not mean predicting the future. When John uses it and calls his book Christian prophecy, what he's doing is situating himself in the context with the Old Testament prophets, whose job it is to proclaim God's message of salvation and God's message of judgment. So that's what John is doing. He's not predicting the future, even though he's showing us something. He's definitely revealing something. But I think if you really consider that those words don't mean what we necessarily think they do, that will help you as we make our way through the book. Another thing to keep in mind is the Roman Empire. That's the backdrop against which John is writing. That was the context in which he and everybody, all his readers, lived. And you could say they lived, in a sense, under occupation. So the Roman Empire was everywhere in that ancient world. They had conquered the entire Mediterranean basin. There was nowhere to go except in the Roman Empire. And Rome aggressively promoted its own theology and its own ideology with propaganda that people in the cities of Revelation, the 7 cities, would have seen on arches, on monuments of all kinds. There would have been civic parades and celebrations. Everywhere people went in their daily life, they were bombarded with the images of the Roman Empire. One of those images is on page 11 of the study, the Gemma Augustea. And we're certainly not saying that people in John's churches would have seen this particular image, although many scholars think there were probably a lot of renditions of this, kind of like billboards around in the ancient world. But I think this is a helpful image to look at, and you might want to just take a look at this, because it shows sort of Rome's propaganda in one image. What you see in this is Emperor Augustus sitting on the throne, sharing the throne with the goddess Roma. So right there you can see that Rome thought that its empire was divinely ordained, and Rome also had a theology that was on coins proclaimed by the slogan Roma Eterna. Rome thought it would last forever, that it was eternal. And on the upper half of that cameo, you've got the transition from one emperor to another. Over on the far left is Tiberius, the next emperor, who's stepping out of his chariot. And the chariot is being driven by the goddess Nike, or the goddess of military victory. And it's this view that the whole world, as structured by Rome, was divinely ordained by God. But what you see in the lower half of that cameo is that the whole thing rests on conquest. Down at the bottom, it's a kind of an upstairs downstairs thing, and in the downstairs scene you see the Roman soldiers taking nations prisoner, enslaving people, torturing them, pulling their hair. So Rome, I think, is showing off its own ideology of empire in this little slide, in this image of how the whole empire rests on the back of conquest, and that Rome thought this was going to be the system that would last forever. But what John does is say no to that vision. I mean, that's his book is written, I think, as a critique of that whole Roman theology and ideology. And John is giving us a vision of hope that the Roman Empire is not going to last forever. It hasn't been divinely ordained by God. And he's going to call on us as Christians to witness in the midst of empire. And he gives his 7 churches a view that it's not Rome that's in charge of the universe, it's God and Jesus. And that's this kind of radical vision of hope that he introduces right here in the opening chapter. He tells his own call story, how he was, how Jesus appeared to him in a vision, a very vivid vision, and told him to write what he sees. And so he's going to unfold for us what he sees. Now, I just want to say a word about one of the other images, because we're going to use art a lot to go through this study. The Dürer woodcuts by Albert Dürer are very helpful for Revelation, as are other artistic images. But what you see right away is you can't depict anything in Revelation literally, which is important to remember as we go through this book. Don't take its images literally. They're deeper than literal images. So that Dürer woodcut, for example, of John with Jesus appearing to him, you can see right there, Jesus has this sword coming out of his mouth. His legs are bright, like burnished bronze. His face is dazzling. But then Jesus begins to speak. Well, literally, if you took this image literally, once Jesus opens his mouth and starts to speak, the sword would fall out of his mouth. And these are among the many things that all artists who have tried to depict Revelation have grappled with. So it's great to see the artistic renditions. It's also helpful to remember you can't take these images literally. And every artist is going to have to take aspects of the imagery symbolically. And I invite you to remember that as we go through Revelation. Don't take these images literally. They're deeper than literal truth that is being revealed to us.